Hi, my name is Ken Wissaker. I'm the Senior Executive Editor at Duke University Press, and I'm really excited and happy to be here today with Alex Blanchette, who's an Associate Professor of Anthropology at Tufts, and has this brilliant and necessary new book out called Porkopolis, American Animality, Standardized Life, and the Factory Farm. It's just come out at really the perfect time. Those of you who read the New York Times have probably seen several articles even diagramming how a factory farm works because of the threat of COVID-19. As an editor, I often work with books over many years sometimes, and then there's the kind of moment when they come out and you can't really predict, like, will that moment be exactly right or just kind of askew from when the book is needed. And Alex, I'm really happy and sad at the same time with the kind of perfectness of the timing with which your book arrived. And maybe you could start there. I'm sure many people know that a lot of the centers for outbreaks in the Plain States were around factory farms and towns just like you described.
Yeah, it's been an intense experience just to follow this and the scale. I had to almost laugh when I've been reading stories the last few months at the degree to which I almost didn't anticipate this. Now, on the one hand, most zoonoses come from animal agriculture, right? The jury's kind of still out on the ultimate cause of this one. But I was thinking back to my research and thinking, like, I've very rarely heard people talk about zoonoses at all, in ways that almost are poetic metaphors of life in these operations. I distinctly remember artificially inseminating sows in 2010, sitting on an animal, which was shortly after the 2009 swine flu outbreaks, and asking people that I worked with if this was ever a topic of discussion. And they'd say no, they could never remember zoonoses being discussed in the workplace. On the other hand, there was constant attention to animal disease, different diseases that only affect pigs, that don't affect human beings, but instead slow down the pace of animal growth or the size of litters and so forth. And in some ways, my book doesn't really talk about zoonoses, and that's in some senses a reflection of this place, which from outside might look really anthropocentric. That's to say, it's about killing animals to feed human beings ostensibly. But from within these operations, everything is about redefining places and people to try to increase the pace of animal growth such that zoonoses, that which affect humans, are not even discussed. But at the same time,
Sorry. Could you say just for people who don't know what zoonoses are?
yeah, zoonosis is a disease that starts in animal populations and spreads to humans, human populations oftentimes.
We should all
without,
know that by now.
yeah. On the other hand, it's kind of not surprising, right? The American slaughterhouse is an almost unique institution within this country. It's pretty much the product of 150 years of accumulated industrial intensity, kind of dates back as one of the original industrial projects to 1850s, 1860s Cincinnati, and it's only become more and more intense, even amidst a broader country that appears to be deindustrializing. The pace and speed and efficiency of slaughter just gets more and more intense, to the point where most of the biggest plants are now killing 20,000 hogs in an 18-hour working day. A hog every 3 seconds, and every space, every inch of these refrigerated warehouses are really built around labor productivity. So alongside the prison, the slaughterhouse has really emerged as one of the key hotspots. As of right now, end of July, I believe 9% of meatpacking workers have been infected. That's about 35,000 people, and almost 170 have died. But what's perhaps been most stunning to me, even if that's not entirely a surprise, what's been stunning has been the seeming total inflexibility of the system. At the early point of the outbreak within the industry, there was a lot of chatter about how these systems would have to change, would have to de-densify. They'd have to stop cutting up animals so finely, which requires like 2,000 workers on a shift. But after Donald Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to kind of grant immunity to corporations for potentially sickening workers, what's been startling is just how little has changed in these operations from what I can see from the outside. It seems at best we have plastic dividers put up between workstations. And, I think that just speaks to the fragility of this compounded, deeply intense industrial system, that it just has to keep moving and killing at this pace or else it risks collapse. And just in a broader sense, I'll say that one of the things that I think this has made explicit, something that's long been implicit to many of us who work in these systems, which is that the human body itself has become a major problem of production. For at least 30, 40 years, line speeds have been moving so fast that injuries are endemic on the line, as we'll probably discuss a little bit later on. In the place where I worked, corporations were worried that there was so much disease in the area that pig diseases were transferring across workers' bodies, that they were constantly they both needed labor and needed cheap labor, but we're also struggling with the ways that they had pushed not only beyond the animal body, but beyond the human body in many ways. And, at this moment, I think we're seeing that play out in fairly dramatic ways.
That sense of extreme tailorization, something that many of us would have associated with like early 20th century factories, like how long does it take the worker to move the brick from here to there or anything else. The way that wasn't surpassed or just a stage of the way factories were organized, but if anything had been broken further down, comes through really, really strongly in the book. And so the way that the line requires everybody to be close to each other, requires that kind of movement. It's hard to see how a factory could just, even with the epidemic, rethink their working process, because you portray it as so central to the way the whole space is organized.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. The only way I could imagine de-densifying a place like that is to really return to how things were done in the 1970s, which was a period before corporations tried to kind of monopolize all value within the pig by not only killing animals or cutting them up into primal muscles like a loin or something like that, but of trying to cut animals down into finer and finer pieces, find value in every single gram of their body, not just the muscles, but also bones, organs, fat, and blood, and really create a profound division of labor around every unique piece of the animal body in order to try to really capture all potential value within the species.
So you grew up in a farm town, right, in Canada?
Yeah.
How did you get into this very different kind of industrial farming as a place to study?
Yeah. So, I was casting around trying to think of a PhD project in the mid-2000s. And, I really wanted my work to have some kind of impact or lesson for the place I grew up in, a fairly tight-knit agricultural community. And that was a community that to some extent was undergoing deindustrialization. And at least as it appeared back then, we also seemed to be seeing deindustrialization alongside of agriculture, like the rise of chicken farms or some pork production. And at that time, I wanted to sort of, however naively in retrospect, I wanted to see what a potential future for my hometown looked like. Like, what would it mean to go to what hailed itself as the most industrial of industrial pork production facilities and see what life is like there, potentially as a premonition of the path that my home area was going down. And so I was looking around for different places, originally across chickens, pigs, and beef cattle, to think about really what's it mean to industrialize an animal? What's the factory and the factory farm? And what do these places look like on the ground? And I found this place with a series of pork corporations in a 100-mile radius region of the US Great Plains and Midwest that was kind of ticked all the boxes. It was massive in scale. They birth, raise, kill about 7 million pigs a year within a 100-mile radius region. They were amongst the most vertically integrated of all regions. That's to say that they control every single piece of the process, from genetic design and boar studs to breeding farms, to raising, to killing, and then to processing pigs' bodies into what amounts to about 1,100 different commodity product codes.
That's amazing. I'm sorry, that's amazing the way that comes across in the book, that things you don't associate with pigs at all are all downstream products of these kind of pig factories.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's an old project. That's the model going back to the Chicago meat packers of the 1890s, pretty much break even on the meat and try to build value in all of the other parts. Like 50% of an animal is not meat. But nonetheless, and though, you know, some commodities have come in and out, I mean, it used to be, you know, tons of products are made from pig fat. But nonetheless, that process is only accelerated across the 20th century as they try to find new and unique products of each physiological part. And kind of tied to that, one of the really striking things about the place was how it seemed to be projecting the development of almost like a closed loop system built out of the pig. You know, they were trying to power barns and slaughterhouses with pig feces, with biogas, taking all of the blood from animals and feeding it back to piglets, or converting the fat into biodiesel to power trucks, right? And then most broadly, they were kind of projecting themselves as having historically unprecedented control over the pig species. For them, they would present vertical integration, not just a matter of trying to make profit off each site, not just to control all sites of profit from pre-life to post-death, but also to try to have this degree of control that would allow them to generate what amounts to a kind of new pig, a really, really uniform animal that can fetch higher prices on global wholesale markets, has a kind of biochemically consistent basis for developing all these different products, and that allows you to increase speeds in the disassembly line.
It's really interesting because in the book, you get the sense of both of this very advanced capitalism, like here's somebody with some products that they are developing even the raw materials for genetically, as you say, and exploiting every single exploitable molecule of the product. So it seems very advanced. At the same time, there's partly what comes across as a small town, like driving out in North Carolina, and you're just in a small town with a couple gas stations and some churches and a few public halls. And the way that the factory becomes the whole town almost seems like something that would be like a pre-Depression era picture of a small town in the US. And yet, like, the corporation has become like the whole center of the town in a way you bring out really well.
Yeah.
Say something about those two things going on at once.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I really struggled with in writing is how do we actually characterize this institution, factory farming, which on one sense is deeply timely, is new, is emergent. We haven't seen this degree of animal uniformity before, this degree of corporate consolidation. On the other hand, it's just profoundly untimely. We're talking about the rebirth of company towns, the buzzwords used by these corporations, vertical integration, standardization. Those haven't really been buzzwords since the heyday of Fordism in the 1920s. In many ways, the place is a throwback. Beyond the fact that it's a site of radical and ardent industrialization in the midst of what's allegedly a post-industrial United States. And so one of the impetus to go study this place was really to get a sense of how people understand capitalism, economics, rural development, and animal life as they actually try to resuscitate seemingly outdated industrial schemes. But on the other hand, as you noted, yeah, it's an interesting place. You know, a town of about 15,000 that's at the center of these operations, a place where about 26 different languages are spoken in the elementary school, but that nonetheless and is entirely organized around pig production. As people used to say, you know, in the book, that like if it wasn't for the hogs, this place would be a ghost town. That like virtually everything, like half the people in this town work directly for the pork industry, and the paychecks from the pork industry subsidize most other forms of life here. But on the other hand, if you'd walk around this town, and at first glance, it doesn't really look any different from another rural community. You'll never, except unless you see a pig's nose sticking out of a truck on the way to slaughter, you'll never see a pig in public space. But on the other hand, the longer I lived there and just had people kind of show me their own ways of seeing and understanding and noticing things in this town, it just became obvious that this was a Porkopolis, which we can talk about in a bit. You know, a place that is entirely organized around pig production. You know, towns on this old stores on this old Americana Main Street really only open at 3 p.m. and go till 10 p.m. after the first shift in the slaughterhouse lets out. I drive by on the highway and see these signs at gas stations that say 100% gas. And I'm sort of asking myself, what does that mean? Why are they advertising that they only use 100% gas? And it's partly because they don't want to use ethanol, which increases the price of animal feed. All of the crops in the region have all been changed to be fed towards pigs. And then, you know, things became, as I lived there longer and worked through these different operations, came to just notice the other ways that, you know, this town is really organized around animal life and death cycles. For instance, one of the more striking things is that managers were intervening in workers' living arrangements to ensure that, say, someone who works in a slaughterhouse was not living with someone who works in a breeding farm, because they're worried that diseases might transfer across their bodies and infect untainted barns of swine. So they in fact started kind of trying to get regional kinship and living arrangements to match their own division of labor and animality across the place.
One of the things that really struck me as editor in the tone is the kind of evenness and generosity you had toward both the people and the kind of neutrality toward the process. Like if you think about the classic of this kind of, when you said Chicago, you know, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or something, and the way this could be an expose. And I felt like from the very first notes in the book, the kind of generosity of like, here are people doing the best under the circumstances in the system that they've been dealt, and that you would find out more, and perhaps this is the ethnographic, you know, by having an empathy to what people's charges were, what their responsibilities were, how their lives could be constructed and viewed. That comes through really strongly. And I wonder if you might say a little about trying to write in that tone and how you see it in relation to both other anthropological writing. And then my colleague Elizabeth Alt has named the rise of all these books on pork raising and killing, critical swine studies. You know, this fits into both science studies and anthropological writing and other work on animals and foodways in a really different way. And want to hear a little bit about how you thought about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot we could talk about there. I mean, you know, I lived in this place for 27 months. I really liked it there. I especially really liked the people there. With all ethnographic projects, I think you form close relationships. And to me, the value of ethnography is not just or not even primarily kind of an immersive participant observation kind of lens, but also that the pages should kind of ripple with the commitments we have to people. You know, I think coming into this project from the outside, like a lot of exposés, I expected to tell a story of, you know, corporate actors' total domination over the animal, and as someone who really does labor studies at the end of the day and is committed to building from the perspective of workers, trying to give a sense of workers' own resistances and views to this operation. And the book is that somewhat, but I remained struck throughout the whole process that, virtually everyone that I met did not necessarily enter this industry of their own choosing. Certainly migrant workers, but also migrant managers who had complicated stories. And I was just struck throughout my research how much managers themselves were struggling to try to find new forms of industrial growth or new forms of what they called new money within this organism that's already been subjected to 150 years of industrial refinement. And so for me, one thing I wanted to do is write a book that is deeply critical. I am certainly not an apologist for factory farming. I had profound problems with it, but one that is not so much critical of individual people or sees these as an outgrowth of people's bad choices or how they think about these things, but instead to tell a more general story about capitalism. To me, what distinguishes factory farms is not, unlike we hear in a lot of journalistic stories, a story of, suddenly industrializing a natural organism, radical changes to how we eat in the last 30 years. To me, these operations are actually what happens when industrial capitalism continues to develop over 150 years. And in some ways, the book is about trying to get at the very limits of industrial capitalism through its own drive and unending search for value. On the other hand, living in this town and working and writing an ethnography only of these operations did force me to confront some of the genres or scripts that I think have been developed in the last 30 to 40 years to write about American meat. The book, I call them the kind of expose genre, but they mostly tend to do two things, which is to begin in towns like the one that I call Dixon, the one I studied in, and show how horrible things are, to show the repetitive motion injuries of workers, to show the treatment of animals and the kind of manure stench of the region, and then use that as a kind of negative narrative contrast device to show the importance of some bucolic farm elsewhere, and so forth. And there's a variety of reasons why I find this move frustrating. But one of them is that it tended to position this town and the planet as just kind of icons of damage, right? As just people without desire of their own, despite profoundly knowing these processes, right? Every day and working in these places, experiencing the mass production of life and death, of really having very little to contribute towards another future. And for me, I wanted to sort of subvert that move a little bit, that comparative move a little bit, by trying to push into and narratively unpack as best I can, however fleetingly, the alternative possibilities that might be emerging from within places like slaughterhouses, bone rendering plants, or artificial insemination lines. And in a broader sense, I think one of the problems of the expose genre for me, and this is maybe unlike Upton Sinclair, who in The Jungle really took the slaughterhouse in Chicago as an icon of industrial capitalism and as an intensification of all of our lives, is that they tend to position the factory farm or animal agribusiness as kind of deviant from the rest of capitalism, like an extreme or something that we can fix outside of tackling industrial capitalism as a whole. And I wanted to push against that, to try to say, actually, this is a highly overdeveloped version of industrial capitalism functioning normally, and begin from there.
This is really fantastic and says a lot about why the book is so necessary and such a model ethnography, where you take like one small place and then it turns out to be something that really helps us understand everything. I think it's well worth everybody's attention and read, especially now. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to add or had hoped to mention?
I think I'll just broadly go back to the part of your previous question I missed, which is that I also wanted to write a book that wouldn't make a priori distinctions between different issues, whether they're worker issues or animal issues. I think a lot of writing, not all, but a lot of writing on slaughterhouses and farms tends to begin from the sense that we can either prioritize the interests of animals or prioritize the interests of workers. And instead, I want to try to set out and write an ethnography of the industrial pig, by which I mean both, I mean that quite literally, not just tracing this animal's life from pre-life to post-death, but of tracing the different kinds of human living and human subjectivity and human organization that emerge out of this very fragile, quite damaged being, in order to try to think about both the ways that the pig today is a reflection of how we live, of the forms of labor exploitation that we live with, the forms of racial capitalism that structure work, and at the same time to show that the ways that it's very difficult to talk about human dignity and labor justice at work without taking into account the conditions of animal lives that profoundly affect workers, whether they're having to change who they live with because of diseases spreading, or whether they work with runted animals all day that are very, very fragile. In many ways, I think we need to stop thinking about these two human and animal spheres as separate interests, and instead understand how the factory farms long pushed beyond that. And we need to think about how labor justice and environmental and animal justice are all tied together.
That you could do all that so eloquently in this book with such care and attention and in such a writerly way is just a huge, huge achievement. Thank you so much for talking today, and I really hope everybody takes a look at this because it's just really a fantastic, fantastic book. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for having me, Ken.